Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 1st of March 2024. I can't help but give big videos out at the moment because there's so much going on and I don't like doing lots of long videos. You guys have got other things to do than just listen to me, and I've got other things to do probably. Walking around the house, shuffling along into the lounge and tripping over the threshold. I've got that to do today. So, but there just is so much to talk about. So I will talk about it. Okay, the first thing to say is on the back of what I just did in my last video, which is talk at length about the usage of Russian jets to drop those aerial, those aviation, carb bombs. The Russians are, as mentioned, using those a lot. Those bombs, but also flying riskily quite a lot, even though, and there is talk now that another Su-35, not Su-34, but Su-35 has been lost. So that's possibly one more plane. That's a chatter going on at the moment. It disappeared from radar. So one plane has been lost by the Russians today, potentially. But here is an example of a flyby of 6 planes. So I just think that's really important, that Su-25s going to attack in the Avdiivka direction. Each of those might be carrying 4 to 6 bombs. So that is potentially something like 24 to 30 bombs being dropped on the Ukrainian forces in the Avdiivka direction. That is how devastating the use of these bombs is, and that is why the Ukrainians are risking high value air defense systems near the front, and it's why the Russians themselves are risking back the use of those planes, because they know how important those carb bombs are. It's why Ukraine needs the F-16, says Sharky here. These Russian bastards need a little competition so they don't get so cocky. They are I don't know whether it's cocky or just risky. The risks over, the outcome, the gains, the rewards overcome the risks for the Russians, it seems. Right, going on to military aid, military equipment. The European Parliament, by an overwhelming majority of votes, so that's 451 voting, for and 46 against, another 49 abstained. The European Parliament, by an overwhelming majority of votes, adopted a resolution calling on the EU states to support Ukraine with weapons in the necessary quantities, quote, until victory. This is a really important move. It's not only about we are going to provide weapons for you to help you, and we're going to put that to vote, and it has, we are held accountable, hopefully, by what we vote on. But it's also the very important language of until victory. So European Parliament calls on EU to, quote, give Ukraine whatever it needs to defeat Russia. The European Parliament adopted a resolution calling on the EU member states to support Ukraine with, quote, whatever it needed for Kyiv to win its war against Russia, including long-range weapons. To ensure Kyiv's victory, the EU should have, quote, no self-imposed restriction on military assistance to Ukraine, said the resolution. I wonder whether that includes troops on the ground. That is vague enough to allow for troops on the ground. We'll return to that idea later, because I think what Macron's been saying is incredibly important, and I think he's actually saying and possibly doing some of the best things he's done since the beginning of the war right now. Right, European Parliament resolution calls as well for unlimited military support to Ukraine to defeat Russia, including advanced weapons, including Germany's Taurus missile, and a minimum of 0.25% of GDP annually from allies. This seems to be going along with what the Estonian report stated, and why we are seeing them say that for the next 4 years, 0.25% of GDP will be given to Ukraine aid. I wonder whether it's being adopted more widely. That really interesting stuff. Now, British MP says Scholz reveals sensitive information on Ukraine military support to Ukraine, and French as well information. So I did a breaking news update on this yesterday. It turns out that when Scholz gave his reasons for not helping not giving tourists to Ukraine, one of the reasons was he didn't want German soldiers, German forces to be on the ground in Ukraine, like the French and UK forces are to program their missiles. He didn't want German forces to be on the ground to do that for the tourists, and thus for Germany to, quote, participate in the war. And by saying that, he dropped the British and French in on it by saying, well, they are in Ukraine at the moment, and by extension, they are participating in the war. So British MP Tobias Ellwood accused German Chancellor Olaf Scholz of flagrant abuse of intelligence when he mentioned to journalists that the British and French support Ukraine with missile guidance, according to the Daily Telegraph. And I went through that with you, and loads of people piled in on Olaf Scholz, both internally and externally. And it's the idea that we do have forces on the ground in Ukraine helping and letting that cat out of the bag, but also just the idea that we're participating in the war and Germany doesn't want to participate in the war in that way. So lots of people piled in. Scholz's behaviour showed that as far as the security of Europe goes, he's the wrong man in the wrong job at the wrong time. So that's Ben Wallace, the former UK Secretary of Defence. How long will Scholz's coalition partners tolerate this? And we've seen since then this language between France and Germany showing there's a bit of a schism there. And that's not healthy, really, for European unity. But it's kind of Scholz's own doing. Chancellor Olaf Scholz has just clarified his reasons for denying the delivery of Taurus KPD 350 to Ukraine. Now, he gave those reasons before, and then I believe he's just been called out on that. So then he's kind of moving the goalposts a little bit, saying he speaks to the possibility of hitting specific targets in Moscow if the weapon is mishandled, and therefore Germany would need to participate without going into details. So still a little bit about participating to make sure. So it's the idea that the German forces would need to be there to make sure that the Ukrainians don't mishandle the weapon, but it's also calling aspersions on the Ukrainians as if they're not capable enough of learning and doing this themselves. Because, of course, the Taurus is used by other countries without Germans needing to be there. So, for example, South Korea, I think they're ordering some more of them. They use that, and they don't need Germans there when they've learned how to use it. So, anyway, he speaks of the possibility of hitting specific targets in Moscow, and that being an issue. He also repeats his statement that others, France and or Germany, and or Great Britain, have made sure that they know exactly where and how their weapons, Scalp-EG and Storm Shadow, are being used. This time, however, he does not mention any soldiers on Ukrainian soil. So I don't know if he's refining that, trying to be a bit more careful about all of that. John Ridge says he's a bit of an expert in these matters. Scholz explicitly stating that he simply doesn't trust the Ukrainians to adhere to targeting restrictions for tourists. These concerns are, of course, nonsensical. Yeah, I don't know whether it's trust or whether trust the Ukrainians to adhere. It's not maybe about adhering, but it's about mishandling it. But then, if you're going to send it to Moscow, that isn't just, I accidentally sent it to Moscow. That means you've programmed it to do so. So actually, no, John Ridge is right here. That's the implication of what Scholz clearly says. These concerns are, of course, nonsensical. The Ukrainians have adhered to the restrictions placed on Storm Shadow and Scalp-EG employment by the UK and France. Absolutely. So I don't think Scholz is doing himself any favours, and there are continued pressures for Germany to give Taurus to Ukraine. Indeed, Britain is apparently urging Germany to give Taurus to Ukraine, according to Bloomberg. Sources indicate that high-ranking British ministers and officials have repeatedly emphasised to Germany that Ukraine is in dire need of Taurus missiles. Be under no illusions that the rest of Europe is very keen on Germany supplying Taurus. Germany, on the other hand, is less keen. Canadian Minister of National Defence Bill Blair says that they are open to deploying Canadian Forces personnel to Ukraine to conduct training operations. Wow. So we have heard that there are 4 European nations that appear to be keen on that, or at least saying that they are open to it. French President Emmanuel Macron was the first to announce this and explain that his statement was completely deliberate and considered. So Prime Minister of Estonia has said we have to do everything so that Ukraine wins and Russia loses this war. Lithuanian officials are also considering the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine for military training, according to Lithuanian presidential advisor. And the Dutch have become the 4th country whose chief of defense staff does not rule out the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine, but notes that now is not the time to talk about such a scenario. Now, it has to be said that Britain has come out through several channels and said we're not up for it, but we are up for it because we've done it. So that makes no sense. So you can add Britain to that, and obviously France there. Now, I was going to talk about this in the geopolitical section, but let's just see if I can dig it out now, because I think this is really important. Here it is. In fact, no, it's not that one. It is on the French. Yeah, no, I can't find it. So maybe it's in this section we're coming to. So anyway, I think this is good news that people are talking about this. I think it's gives options to allies to be able to give aid that's necessary when it's deemed necessary. If you say we can't do that, we're not going to do that, then when it comes to this desperate situation when you might have to, you've already said you weren't, and then it just means your words don't mean anything. And so I think Macron is exactly right here, and I've got it next actually, and I congratulate him for saying that, for coming out and changing, moving the Overton window so it's now acceptable to talk about that. I think that's really important. Macron has come back to critics. So he's had criticisms from inside and outside his country, but I think most of the criticisms don't really understand what he was saying. It's not like we're going to send French troops to the front lines to fight for the Ukrainians. It's like, no, we're going to have French medics maybe helping out in hospitals. We're going to have French trainers back in Western Ukraine. We're going to have French, we already do have French missile programmers helping to deliver accurate missiles to Russian targets with the Scalp EG. So Macron said of his troop movements, quote, "These are sufficiently serious issues. Every one of the words that I say on this issue is weighed, thought through, and measured." I think that's brilliant rhetoric. I think that's really good. So well done, Macron. Credit where credit's due. He gets a lot of stick, but you know what? You bang on, mate. You're absolutely bang on. And to say, rather than step down and say, "Oh yeah, sorry about that. Ooh, yeah, maybe should we not?" No, he said, "I said what I said, and do you know what? Every single one of my words is weighed, thought through, and measured. I thought about that. I said it, and do you know what? I freaking mean it. So jog on." And that's how I would interpret that. And do you know what? Brilliant. Weighed, thought through, and measured is an excellent start, says Shashank Joshi. And Macron's troop comments were, on their own terms, pretty cautious. What would also be useful is, firstly, more clarity, which came only afterwards from French officials, and more coordination among allies, which is coming, I believe. Macron is right to preserve flexibility and seek ambiguity. Irony is that in March 2022, he did what Scholz is now accused of doing when he annoyed Eastern Europe by ruling out jets and tanks and crossing a red line. Later, he reversed that, of course. Now, don't get me wrong. I think Macron played it incorrectly at the beginning. He was trying to be conciliatory. He was trying to be the peacemaker between Ukraine and Russia, but I think he soon realised, or fairly soon realised, that was getting nowhere, and you can't negotiate with Putin. It's a lost cause, and so therefore he is now gone. We need to win this then. If we can't do peace, then what's the other option? Ukraine loses. Well, that's not an option. Ukraine wins. So we're in this for Ukraine to win, and France will do whatever it takes. Is where he's going with that, and I'm not going to stop him from going down that direction. So, well done, Macron. And UK Defence Secretary Grant Shapps has now, moving on from that, we're moving on to US stuff here. So US Congress he's urging US Congress to approve aid for Ukraine. We're going to come to that a little bit later. Again, so much of what I say is about US politics, but the reason is because it's the single most important aspect of Ukraine's, I guess, eventual success. And certainly right now, they desperately need that US support, and that's why I talk about it so much. So, quote from Shapps, "My message to those on Capitol Hill is really simple. It is, do this because it's in the interest of the United States of America." And actually, that's a pretty good way of putting it. It's like, I could give you all these other reasons, but actually, it's in your own self-interest that you do this. Helping Ukraine helps the US for a whole bunch of reasons that I spent the last year talking to you about. Right. US Congress passes a bill to avoid government shutdown. So there's a worry that government is going to shut down budgets, funding, etc., etc. And they've passed a bit of a stopgap bill. I've been wondering whether discharge bill can be put. So, okay, don't interrupt yourself, Piers. Right. US Congress has passed this stopgap so that the US government can continue to function. And they won't shut down, but it's without Ukraine aid. Now, there's this other thing called a discharge bill that I think you can put in on other bills to then talk about something that you have previously talked about or haven't talked about, and it's a way of getting in your Ukraine aid through the back door. And I don't know whether it could have been done on the back of this, but obviously it hasn't been done. The US Congress approved a short-term stopgap spending bill to avoid a partial government shutdown, sending it for signature to the president, Reuters has reported. Now, you often get Republican lawmakers or voices on the internet saying, yeah, we should go for a shutdown, we should do this rather than do that, or the shutdown stops, money getting spent on government agencies. During a shutdown, as far as I understand it, all the money legally has to be paid to the people who aren't paid during the shutdown as a back payment. So there's no like gain in a shutdown other than screwing over your own population and the services provided to that population. So, anyway, just thought I'd mention that. Department of Defense announced competitions worth $623.9 million for special ammunition, scare quotes, in the last several months. We know now that some of that money is being used to procure tube and rocket artillery ammunition from Romania. That means that these are almost certainly USAI contract awards to procure Soviet pattern ammunition for Ukraine. Now, I don't know what that means going forward, whether that is, they're not providing it now, but I presume they are buying stuff in ready to provide it when they get the green light for that. I mean, I guess it's some kind of funding that allows them to get the stuff but not give the stuff. I don't know. Now, 3 undercover Czechs are looking for ammunition for Kyiv. Not only have they found 800,000 artillery shells, government officials have also found large anti-aircraft missiles and drones in several countries around the world. So if you think of the US being the biggest arms exporter in the world, and then USSR onto Russian Federation, they aren't anymore because of the war, and it's all got screwed up. But that legacy of all of those decades of exporting stuff around the world, there will be many countries around the world that are now in a position to say, actually, we're happy to sell this old stuff. Like Pakistan's a great example. Like, yeah, we're pretty screwed for money. We need a bunch of money. If you want to buy all this stuff, please go for it. It's not a case of them being allied to Ukraine or against Russia. It's like, you got the money, we'll sell the stuff, because it's about time we renewed this stuff anyway. So there's no doubt an awful lot of kit kicking around the warehouses of the world that can be used to help Ukraine. It's just going to be a case of money, I'm sure. Right, France will deliver 100 Delair DT-46 kamikaze attack drones to Ukraine by the summer. Again, France is now stepping up a little bit more. We're starting to hear what they have given previously has often been a bit secretive. I wonder whether France are going to adopt this kind of like, okay, we're going to be a main player here, and actually we're going to tell you a little bit more about what we're doing, because actually this is a game of PR, this is a game of virtue signaling, this is a game of, I wonder whether they'll play that game a little bit more. Right, Bulgaria is finally going to get those 100 BTR armored personnel carriers to Ukraine within the coming days. So next several days, they're due to go to Ukraine. There's been this argument as who's going to pay for the transport. And I think, is it Czechia has stumped up some of the cash for the transport of that? Or is it, I think it's Czechia, not Poland. But anyway, finally, I think it's Czechia because they're next door. Bulgaria are going to, or near it, are going to provide those 100 APCs finally. Greece is preparing to transfer new security assistance to Ukraine, which may include air defense and anti-aircraft weapons. Exactly what I was talking about before, Soviet-era weapons that Greece has. These are weapons that are no longer used by Greece's own armed forces. Quote, we are supplying Ukraine with everything we can and everything we have been asked to supply to the best of our ability. That's interesting because there's been a lot of talk about them being not so quick and about supplying stuff, but only once they get the much better US equipment in to replace that. Nonetheless, the language here from Spiros Lampridis is good. Greece's special representative to Ukraine. We are doing everything we can, and we're doing everything we've been asked to do. They are in a very important position to be able to help because they do have a fair bit of kit that the Ukraine can use. In the first 2 months of 2024, 46 examples of weapons and military equipment developed and manufactured in Ukraine have already been put into operation, according to the Deputy Minister of Defense. Also, the production of new types of weapons began. The Bogdana self-propelled howitzer, electronic warfare systems, drones, etc. So Ukraine is now starting to is in the process of ramping up its industrial military complex such that it can meaningfully make equipment for itself. Now, drones is obviously one of the main areas we hear about an awful lot, but things like self-propelled howitzers, missiles as well, electronic warfare systems. And on that note, Ukraine has produced now 200,000 FPV drones. So just first-person view drones, just that kind of attach a munition to it, throw it into a Russian vehicle. 200,000 of them since the beginning of the year. So that's 100,000 a month, with reference to the Ministry of Strategic Industries of Ukraine, or maybe just less than that if you include... No, that's 200,000. That's before the end of February, and February is a short month. So that's good. That's 100,000 a month. The president spoke about 1 million drones. Our capacities already allow us to produce even more, reports the Deputy Minister for Strategic Industries, Hannah Horozgia. Right, moving on. John Sweeney, I'm going to contact him. Let's have another chat, John. Friends just back from the front line say artillerymen and ammo shortages are so bad that Kramatorsk, Kupiansk, and even Kharkiv could fall. Schultz, Speaker Johnson, and Donald Trump are helping Russia. We need to help Ukraine now. So he is very forthright in his support for Ukraine, but also in who's not pulling their weight. Schultz gets a bit of a raw deal here because actually Germany has helped loads. Let's not forget all the great stuff they've done. Don't just be completely biased by the tourists, but of course they need to provide the tourists as well. I just don't see the sense in them not doing so. Now, to talk about Kramatorsk, Kupiansk, and Kharkiv falling is huge, right? And Ukrainians are worried, genuinely. I talk to Greg on a regular basis, and he speaks to people right on the front line. He was behind the front line, I think, yesterday. But anyway, he talks about how things are really tough. But I was saying back to him, look, he's quite, not doom and gloom, but things are really bad. And any help that comes in is help that's going to be too late, possibly. My silver lining to that cloud, or at least the way I would interpret that as positively as possible, is it's always going to be difficult when you are micro looking at the front line. So when you go and visit people saying, yeah, we've lost this many people, and we've lost this many vehicles that we sent into the front line, you're like, things are terrible. Things are terrible. Ukrainians are moving back. But my idea is that I can't see Russia taking Odessa, right? And I can't see Russia increasing their production capacities in all forms of equipment in line with what Ukraine will be able to do with Western help. So if you look at Ukraine's own industrial capacities improving, and then all of their allies improving, or what Rheinmetall is doing in terms of artillery shell manufacture, what the US is doing, assuming US can continue to help and will continue to help, then actually you put all of that together, and the macro picture for Ukraine, I think, is positive. The big thing, as I keep saying, is mobilization. If they can sort out mobilization, boots on the ground, but again, if the Western nations are also talking about the potential for boots on the ground somewhere in Ukraine for Western allies, then the macro picture for Ukraine is looking better than it is for Russia, even though the micro picture right now particularly is looking fairly horrendous. That's how I'd interpret that. So news from the ground is looking bad, and Russia have put Ukraine on the back foot. How long can they continue to do that? Do they have the troops and equipment to do that? I mean, really, could they take Kharkiv? They can't, in my book. But Ukrainians are feeling that, and they're thinking that, and people on the front line are recognizing that it's really terrible on the front line for the Ukrainians in certain places. Now, going to the American provision of aid, Speaker Johnson, who is your one guy, yeah, okay, being fed by Trump, but his situation is like, if I do this, I lose my seat. So he doesn't want to do it. but he says that the House will consider Ukraine aid as soon as government is funded. So there's been a partial funding, and I presume that he's waiting for a proper bill to go through. And this is speaking to a Voice of America, VOA correspondent, as he walked down. I don't know how considered that response was and whether he would go back on that. But the idea is, yeah, we'll consider aid when we get the government funded, rather than when we get the border sorted. Now, if that's a change in rhetoric, if he's actually being pressured by other Republicans who are more sensible than him in terms of foreign policy, that's really, really good. Yeah, he needs to show some contrition for making a balls up of the last couple of months. But man, if he says, yeah, we're gonna do that, then good luck. I hope it happens. U.S. House Speaker Johnson told Voice of America that his chamber would consider $60 billion in aid for Ukraine as soon as the government is funded. Several Republicans, though, are backing a discharge petition. I talked about that, to force a vote on Ukraine aid. So possibly he's considering the fact that it's going to happen anyway. And if it's going to happen anyway, he might as well... I don't know what he's thinking. Maybe... if he thinks that he still could be vacated for doing that by some of those MAGA people, though. So if he goes, well, if it's going to happen anyway, I might as well get behind it. Even if he's seen to get behind it, that might not be to his benefit, personally speaking. Anyway, whatever. GOP representative Brian Fitzpatrick has disclosed that several Republicans are prepared to go around Speaker Johnson to force an aid vote. There are good Republicans there who are willing to do the right thing, irrespective of how that might affect support from Trump and their base. And I just hope there are enough good Republicans to do that, and I'm sure there are. Now, Trump, as I've mentioned, is set to privately meet with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. He's not meeting Democratic leaders. He's meeting a quasi dictator, or a dictator wannabe, who's moving his own democracy towards illiberalism and towards authoritarianism. That's who Trump likes. That's the kind of person Trump likes, and that's who he's meeting with at Trump's Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach next week. Orban, a right-wing nationalist, has been a long-time ally of Trump and shares close ties with the US populist conservative movement. CPAC, the conservative conference, has taken place in Budapest twice. I've written a big article on the money going from Russia to Hungary, through Hungary to CPAC and Heritage and Tucker Carlson. Follow the money, you understand what's going on. And this, of all the things that worry me about Trump, this is his predilection for authoritarian rulers, and therefore his approach to foreign policy is the biggest challenge. Now, this is why Anne Applebaum, who is married to, I believe, Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, why is Trump trying to make Ukraine lose? So this is an Atlantic piece that I'm going to read from because I think it's important. And I know some of you will hate me continuing to talk about Trump, but as the article states here, even without being in a position, in a political position, Trump is affecting foreign policy. The man is affecting US support for Ukraine. He is affecting foreign policy. So we have to talk about him. Right, the article, I'll dip into it later. I'm going to read most of it. It is a very good article. For outsiders, this reality is mind-boggling, difficult to comprehend, and impossible to understand. In the week that the border compromise failed, I happened to meet a senior European Union official visiting Washington. He asked me if congressional Republicans realized that a Russian victory in Ukraine would discredit the United States, weaken American alliances in Europe and Asia, embolden China, encourage Iran, and increase the likelihood of invasions of South Korea or Taiwan. Don't they realize? Yes. Don't they realize? Yes, I told him. They realize. Johnson himself said in February 2022 that a failure to respond to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, quote, empowers other dictators, other terrorists and tyrants around the world. If they perceive that America is weak or unable to act decisively, then it invites aggression in many different ways. Yeah, so he admits that, Johnson, but why does he make the decisions he's making? Well, as she goes on, but now the speaker is so frightened by Trump that he no longer cares, or perhaps he's so afraid of losing his seat that he can't afford to care. This is exactly what I've been saying. So my European colleague shook his head, not because he didn't believe me, but because it was so hard for him to hear. And we'll return to that idea later. Good repetition. Since then, I've had a version of that conversation with many other Europeans in Munich and elsewhere, and indeed many Americans. Intellectually, they understand that the Republican minority is blocking this money on behalf of Trump. They watch first McCarthy, then Johnson fly to Mar-a-Lago to take instructions. You got that picture of both Kevin McCarthy and then Mike Johnson with his thumbs up next to Trump with his MAGA hat on. Thumbs up. He's towing the party line. They know that Senator Lindsey Graham, a prominent figure in the Munich Security Conference for decades, backed out abruptly this year after talking with Trump. And I said to you, he turned on a sixpence, Lindsey Graham. Why did he turn on a sixpence? Almost certainly because there's compromise on him because of his sexual proclivities. And so the Republicans in the UK in Parliament, there's a little black book that whips hold. So they hold that book and it's basically got compromise on you. And they know if you're not voting with the government, and there's a really famous 1990s documentary on this, the Little Black Book, and recently there's been lots of issues with the use of party whips in the UK Parliament, particularly with the Conservatives. They do this, so that compromise will be held over Senator Lindsey Graham, and that's the only thing I can think of that where he turned on a sixpence. He, as mentioned here, he's a long-term supporter of Ukraine. He's been at the Munich Security Conference for years, and then he doesn't turn up, and he's changed his views on Ukraine aid, prima facie aid, and he's talking about border aid has to happen first, and this has to happen. He's basically talking Trump. So after talking to Trump, he doesn't turn up to the Munich Security Conference. They see that Donald Trump Jr. routinely attacks legislators who vote for aid to Ukraine, suggesting that they be primaried. So when you've got Trump's son on social media attacking people who vote for Ukraine aid, and saying these guys should be primaried, so they should be kicked out by their own Republican Party and replaced with people who will toe the party line. That's why you get this fear from Republicans, and why it's so important when some of them are standing up and saying, actually, Brian Fitzpatrick here is saying, even though he's going to be pilloried by people like Donald Trump Jr., he's still going to stand up and do the right thing. That's super important. We need to congratulate them when they do that, because that's a big risk, because the internal politics is so, I don't know, egregious in my book. The ex-president's son has also said that the US should cut off the money to Ukrainians because, quote, it's the only way to get them to the table. In other words, it's the only way to make Ukraine lose. Donald Trump Jr., goodness, if you support Trump, listen to the words of Trump and listen to the words of his son, right? If he's saying we should give no more money to Ukraine, and you are a Trump supporter and believe that we should be giving money to Ukraine to aid them, how do you square the circle? How do you justify still belief that Donald Trump's a good guy here when his son is saying we want to get them to the table, which means get them to the table after they lose because we're not giving them aid, and then at the table they are in no position to be able to retain the territory which is rightfully theirs. In other words, Donald Trump Jr. is justifying Russia getting what they want out of this war. In other words, Donald Trump Jr. is doing Putin's bidding. There is no other way of interpreting that. And if you do, it means your cognitive dissonance reduction is so strong that you cannot handle liking the Trumps and liking Ukraine. So you have to do some funky stuff to reduce that dissonance. As many other analysts have said, you cannot be a Trump supporter and a Ukraine supporter. It's too difficult. You have to do mental gerrymandering to do that. And I would agree. Now, I know some of you will not like that, and I have discussions with you consistently on my threads because you guys still love Trump, and you love him for many other reasons, but I'm sorry, he's so desperately wrong on international politics, which is so dangerous for the world, existentially, that it's just too important to let that go. You can't compartmentalize support of Trump, in my opinion. So, as she continues, many also understand that Trump is less interested in fixing the border, the project he forced the Senate to abandon, than he is in damaging Ukraine. He surely knows, as everybody does, that the Ukrainians are low on ammunition. He must also know that right now, no one except the US can help. Although European countries now collectively donate more money to Ukraine than we do, and the numbers are rising, they don't yet have the industrial capacity to sustain the Ukrainian army, exactly what I've been saying the last few weeks. By the end of this year, European production will probably be sufficient to supply the Ukrainians to help them outlast the Russians and win the war, but for the next 9 months, US military support is needed. Boom. That paragraph is on point. Yet Trump wants Congress to block it. Why? This is the part that nobody understands. Unlike his son, Trump himself rarely talks about Ukraine because his position isn't popular. Most Americans don't want Russia to win. Often, Trump's motives are described as isolationist, but this is not quite right. The isolationists of the past were figures such as Senator Robert Taft, the son of an American president and the grandson of an American Secretary of War. Taft, a loyal member of the Republican Party, opposed US involvement in World War II because, as he said once, an quote, over-ambitious foreign policy could destroy our armies and prove a real threat to the liberty of the people of the United States. But Trump's not concerned about our armies. He disdains our soldiers as, quote, suckers and, quote, losers. And that's hyperlinked to give you evidence of where he said that. I can't imagine that he is terribly worried about, quote, the liberty of the people of the United States either, given that he's already tried once to overthrow the American electoral system and might well do it again. Trump and the people around him, I think this is a really good article, by the way. It really gives you an insight as to what's going on. Trump and the people around him are clearly not isolationists in the old-fashioned sense. An isolationist wants to disengage from the world. Trump wants to remain engaged with the world, but on different terms. Trump has said repeatedly that he wants to deal with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And maybe this is what he means. If Ukraine is partitioned or if Ukraine loses a war, then Trump could twist that situation to his own advantage. Perhaps some speculate Trump wants to let Russia back into international oil markets. Now, if you listen to his discussion with who was it? It was not PBS. It was ABC. I think that massive hour-long talk where he was really clear about his views on Ukraine. He talked a lot about Russia and the oil markets and how wonderful he was when he is in charge because of the oil markets and the oil markets and the oil markets and Putin and the oil markets. If you go back to that, in fact, I'm going to find you that now so you know what I'm talking about. Here it is. Actually, this video is not the full-length version. It's just a little clip from it. It's NBC News. Yes.
Including the Ukrainian.
So Trump reacts to Putin's praise. I like that he said that. Actually, the full-length one is what you want to look at. But anyway, it's that interview where he talks about oil quite a lot. And this is exactly what, we need to listen to these people. Like, my criticisms of Trump aren't just like out of complete liberal bias. It's like what he has said and what his son says and what he says repeatedly. He's hoisted by his own petard here. Like this is him hanging himself out to dry in terms of what his approach is. So Trump has said repeatedly he wants to deal with Putin. Twist it to own his advantage. Perhaps some speculate Trump wants to let Russia back into international oil markets and get something in return for that. But that explanation might be too complex. Maybe he just wants to damage President Joe Biden, or he thinks Putin will help him win the 2024 election. The Russian hacking of the Democratic National Committee was very beneficial to Trump in 2016. Perhaps it could happen again. I think this idea that it's become a partisan thing, so helping Ukraine is to help Biden, and he won't help Biden. I think that explains an awful lot. Trump is already behaving like the autocrats he admires, pursuing transactional politics. I keep talking about how he's really transactional. That will profoundly weaken the United States, but he doesn't care. Liz Cheney, one of the few Republicans who understands the significance of this moment, describes the stakes like this, quote, "We are at a turning point in the history, not just of the nation, but of the world." Now, Liz Cheney is a Republican that many Trumpists will call a rhino, Republican in name only. She's not. If you look at a voting record, it's with Trump with like 95% of what Trump did when he was president. She is one of the most conservative politicians, right? She is a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. And if you call her a rhino, it means you don't know what you're talking about. I've just bought her book. I'm going to listen to her book. And that's someone that I vehemently disagree with politically. But her views on the Constitution, on her views on what Trump did, I think are on point. But anyway. Yeah, we are at a turning point in history, not just in the nation, but of the world. Once the US is no longer the security guarantor of Europe, and once the US is no longer trusted in Asia, then some nations will begin to hedge to make their own deals with Russia and China. Others will seek their own nuclear shields. Companies in Europe and elsewhere will now spend billions on US energy investments, or US weapons will make different kinds of contracts. The United States will lose the dominant role it played in a democratic world since 1945. That is an on-point paragraph. if the US walks away from Ukraine now, it walks away from being at the top of the hegemonic ladder. It walks away from global influence, and it hands that to Russia and China and says, "Go with it, guys." All of this could happen if Trump doesn't win the election. So right now, so in other words, this could happen even if Trump doesn't win the election, because right now, even if he never regains the White House, he's already dictating US foreign policy, shaping perceptions of America in the world. Even if the funding for Ukraine ultimately passes, the damage he has done to all of America's relationships is real. Anton Hofreiter, a member of the German parliament, told me in Munich that he fears Europe could someday be competing against three autocracies: Russia, China, and the United States. When he said that, it was my turn to shake my head. Not because I didn't believe him, but because it was so hard to hear. And when you then look at the information world that we see around us, David Sachs here, like this numbnut of a he is an American that is spouting pro-Russian stuff. NATO depleted. NATO is in no way prepared for war with Russia. It is in far worse shape today than it was before the Ukraine war, because NATO has shipped vital weapons off to Ukraine, depriving itself of key defense assets such as ammunition, armor, and missiles. I mean, he's just spouting Russian propaganda. He never did. So what kind of compromat do they have on this effing guy, says someone. Actually, someone says, well, they do have a story about him sexually assaulting a Thai girl during a bachelor party in Bangkok in 2007. So, yeah, do we have another person with compromat held over them? And then when you look at the information space, even looking at the mainstream media, there is an issue. So this is the New York Times writing an article. Putin says West risks nuclear conflict if it intervenes more in Ukraine. In other words, the New York Times is, although you could say, well, that's true, and this is Putin has said that. The way that's kind of written, the way you report this is to scare the world into doing what Putin wants, which is like, if we keep supporting Ukraine, then he's going to let off nukes. Quote, "We also have weapons that can strike targets on their territory," Mr. Putin said in an annual speech. Do they not understand this? The way that is written is to the benefit of Russia. So as Anastasia Kilmash here says, the most hilarious part, the article is written by the same person who wrote the quote, "Putin quietly signals he is open to a ceasefire in Ukraine." Nuclear fear-mongering is a huge part of Russian propaganda, and that's how you reinforce it, she says. This is our own media often does the work of the Russian propaganda arms in laying out the groundwork, in setting the conditions for thinking about the war in Ukraine, for building the landscape, the information landscape in which we sit, and it's not cool. Anyway, Biden wants progress on using frozen Russian money to help Ukraine by the June G7 meeting. I don't get this. Someone else, who was it? Was it Tim White, or was it Phillips O'Brien, was saying, how come we're talking about this again? We've been talking about this for a year. Every week it's like, the EU or the G7 or the US administration are looking into the legal ramifications of using frozen Russian assets. Okay, and now it's going to happen by the end of June, or by June. It's like, it should be happening now. Why have we not got a grip on this? I don't get it. Biden is to meet with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni to hold talks amid Ukraine concerns. Scheduled to meet at the White House on March 1st, that's today, amid challenges faced by the Democratic administration in garnering support from House Republicans for legislation aimed at providing assistance to Ukraine. I don't know what she can do to help, but goodness me, something needs to happen. Now, France, I'm going to continue giving props to France. France is clearly on a major counterintelligence drive against Russia at the moment. The country's internal security service is investigating an attempt to destabilize the European elections by pro-Russians in France. Now, there has been interference in and influence in France already. The France Rally, the old Front National, headed by Marine Le Pen, has got very strong connections to Russia. The fomenting of discord in European politics I've written about this with Russia influencing particularly ultra-nationalist movements around Europe. They are sowing division and driving wedges into unity in Europe. And it's great that the DGSI, the French intelligence services, are looking into this. And it's showing that things are serious. France is recognizing that Russia is the enemy at the moment. Now, just as a sidebar, I'm going to one day do a video on the TV programs I like. In my top 10, there are so many. Weirdly, me and my partner, we've watched, my partner and I have watched a whole bunch of stuff, but often there are European ones in there. Two of my top, maybe in my top 5, definitely two of my top 10 are Engrenage, which is Spiral. It's called Spiral in English. Engrenage in French is freaking brilliant. This is in my top 3 probably. And Bureau, or Bureau de Legende in French, is a really good series about the DGSI and about their counterintelligence work in the Middle East and elsewhere, and Iran. Really, really good series. Go and watch it. Other European group ones, Borgen, which is like the Danish version of, and that's on Netflix actually, and BBC iPlayer. Borgen is the Danish version of West Wing. And West Wing is amazing, of course. And The Bridge, another Danish-Swedish one there, really good. I love The Bridge, I love Borgen, and I love the Bureau, and I love Spiral. So go and watch them. Oh, choice, mate. Oh, that's really bloody good. Oh, look, it's great that sanctions are really something that's really important to Kiwis, because at the end of the day, look, we really support Ukraine, but we're just a bloody long way away. We just don't know what to do, really. So we could send you a couple of rugby balls. We could send you some fish and chips, but really, we're going to help with some sanctions. So, good on you. Thanks, New Zealand. It poses additional sanctions on 61 individuals and entities supporting the war in Ukraine. The sanctions target those procuring weapons and technologies for defense industries, including people involved in the purchase of weapons from North Korea. I don't know how effective New Zealand sanctions would be. I don't know what goes through New Zealand, but that's really good news. Thanks, New Zealand. New sanctions package from Japan includes 12 more people and 36 organisations associated with Russia, reports the Office of the President. Sanctions includes asset freezes, blocking of accounts, and export restrictions. They include, or they contain, Rosatomflot, Tinkoff Bank, Novator, Aeroscan, Kalishnikov, Ural Vagonzavod, Diamond, Antheus, and Fedorenko. Now, I don't understand why these guys are being targeted 2 years later. That should have been like the first week. I mean, it's brilliant, thanks to Japan and all that. But I don't get why, like, Kalashnikov and Ural Vagonzavod, which is a defense ministry contractor, wasn't sanctioned, like, in week 1. What do I know? Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said that Poland will consider banning food imports from Russia after analysing the impact of the same decision by Latvia. Now, okay, so starting tomorrow, Polish farmers will partially block traffic on the border with Lithuania for a week, according to Agriculture Minister. The protesters accuse grain traders of allegedly turning Ukrainian grain into Lithuanian grain that ends up in the Polish market. Prime Minister believes that the action of Polish farmers, though, looks like a hybrid operation of Russian special services to turn Ukraine's allies against each other, and I would agree there. The European Commission has decided to allocate 1.4 billion euros to Polish farmers. To quote, today the European Commission adopted 2 legal acts that will give Poland access to EU funding worth up to 137 billion euros, said the EU, and part of that will go to the farmers. Now, an investigation has shown that Polish trucks ship Russian so on the one hand, the Polish are saying, the farmers are saying, and hauliers, we are going to stop grain coming from Ukraine through Lithuania into Poland. But an investigation has shown that the Polish trucks themselves ship Russian agricultural goods to Poland from Belarus. Polish trucks ship Russian agricultural goods to Poland from Belarus, with their volumes increasing, according to an investigation by Ukrainska Pravda. While agricultural trade with Russia and Belarus is not prohibited or sanctioned in the EU, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk recently said they would consider following Latvia's example. So there's such double standards from the people that are protesting, and that to me shows that they're protesting mainly on behest of Russia and not to do with anything particularly ideological. India is seeking a substitute for Russian oil due to sanctions. Refinery managers familiar with this situation reported to Bloomberg that tightening US sanctions are hindering oil trade between India and Russia, forcing the country to explore other supplies. So this is really good news. In particular, oil supplies to India from Saudi Arabia have increased 22% this month compared with January. And then finally, no mainstream media have even mentioned Russia's financial problems. Maybe they don't understand it, but data can be found here at the KSE Institute. There's data that's explored here. This shows how Russia has depleted the National Wealth Fund, its state reserve. So if we look at this, I mean, we can go and look at lots more data, and I could read you stuff that I don't understand, so I won't. But I do vaguely understand this, which is, okay, Russia heavily relied on the National Wealth Fund, depleting around 50% of its liquid assets, 4.8 trillion rubles since February 22. In December 23, hard currency holdings, including euros, hit zero. So no hard currency holdings, only 55 billion in yuan. So in that is 32.6 billion in Chinese yuan holdings and 22.3 billion in gold. So that's the only kind of liquidity, it seems, remain. So that is a real challenge to the Russians, and they are chomping through their reserves. Other non-liquid assets, 43.7 billion, and Sberbank shares, 34.9 billion, so shares in a bank. So really, they are using up their reserves, and actually 32.6 billion of that can only be spent in China anyway. So this is a challenging situation for the Russian economy. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. It's been another long one because there's a lot of news today, and I went through that article. Anyway, sorry, not sorry. Take care. Speak soon.